I want to talk a little bit about the accusation that we within the men's rights movement do not address extremism within our movement. This is an argument that I've seen made more and more lately. It's not a new one. Actually, it's quite old, but it is becoming more and more prevalent, and it's being used under more and more flimsy circumstances in more and more flimsy ways. So I'm going to talk about some of the different ways in which it's getting used and why it's not a good argument. So the first one I want to point out is the tendency of critics to apply the MRA label to anyone that they consider misogynistic or to anyone whose expressed viewpoint they consider extreme in order to claim that MRAs are extreme and misogynistic. And they do this with individuals who do not claim to be MRAs, who do not participate in men's rights initiatives, who are not a part of men's rights discussion forums, who have nothing to do with the movement and no activity within the movement. A good example of this is the Elliot Rodger case, in which man boobs convinced numerous mainstream media sources that Elliot Rodger was a men's rights activist. This was a guy who even rejected the pickup artist community, and pickup artists are not men's rights activists per se, but are part of the manosphere that feminists like to label MRAs. And here we had people labeling him an MRA in order to besmirch the men's rights movement. So this is actually not a genuine argument that the movement doesn't do anything about extremists within the movement, but that we do not own extremists from outside the movement simply because our critics want to consider all things misogynistic to be part of the movement on the basis that they consider the movement misogynistic. This is not a good argument because you're not going to convince the men's rights movement that we are doing anything wrong. Trying to insert people into the movement that we've never been involved with will only demonstrate to us that your criticisms are not legitimate. Trying to convince the general public that individuals from outside the movement are part of the movement will only work insofar as the general public does not seek out more information. But because the men's rights movement is going to be right there to correct the record, in the end, you're only going to look stupid and dishonest. So it's a bad argument. Another way the accusation that we don't deal with extremism within our movement is fronted is by treating satire as if it is not satire. This has been done numerous times by various critics of the men's rights movement, mostly feminists, and used repeatedly as a way of attempting to claim that we advocate things that we don't advocate. Even after being alerted to the fact that the piece that they are criticizing is satire, and even after being alerted to the point behind each individual piece that they criticize, these particular critics like to continue to front that claim. Quite frequently, they will continue to argue that their reading of the piece is the accurate reading of the piece, and the author's intended meaning of the piece isn't. One good example of this is Paul's Bash a Violent Bitch article. The whole point of that article was that it is wrong, just the same as it's wrong for a man to abuse a woman. It is wrong for a woman to abuse a man. Feminists are outraged by that argument to the point where they will treat being told that women should not be allowed to beat men as an argument that men should be allowed to beat women. I actually don't believe that any of them are reading that into that article. I think they're just so outraged at being told that it's just as bad for a woman to hit a man that they had to come up with some way to attack the article, and that was it. I think a lot of other people, once they see the full story of that, come to the same conclusion. And when you make that argument, when you try to accuse the men's rights movement of extremism for arguing that it's just as bad for a woman to hit a man as it is for a man to hit a woman, you end up looking more like an advocate for a woman's right to abuse men than you do an advocate against abuse of women. So that's a bad argument too. Another way in which the MRAs don't deal with extremism within the movement argument is made is to attribute positions to the movement that are not men's rights positions. One example of this is calling the movement anti-abortion. The movement itself does not have a solid position on abortion. There are MRAs who are pro-abortion. There are MRAs who are anti-abortion. There is not a men's rights position on abortion. Being an MRA does not make all of an individual's political perspective the men's rights movement's position. At the same time, being pro-abortion isn't necessarily a women's position. There are women who are against abortion. Not all of them consider themselves anti-feminist. In fact, there are feminists who are against abortion. Abortion itself is a highly contentious, much debated topic. And there isn't really any political group that can honestly say they are united on it. So using abortion as an argument against the men's rights movement really doesn't have much of an effect other than to demonstrate that you yourself have a position on abortion and you yourself have a position on men's rights advocacy. It's not a good argument. Another position that gets attributed to the movement that is not a movement position is wanting to take away women's voting rights. The men's rights movement has not lobbied to take away women's voting rights. There has not been any bill proposed by any MRA or any group of MRAs that would do so. Many of us have pointed out that women have not had to do the same things that men had to do in order to obtain voting rights, and many of us have pointed out that the suffragettes wrongly gendered the fight for voting rights, putting women's voting rights ahead of men's voting rights. Some of us have pointed out that there were men whose voting rights were not recognized long after the suffragettes won their victory. None of this is the argument that laws should be passed or amendments should be changed or any other legal action should be taken to take away women's voting rights. So if you're going to attribute this as a men's rights position, you really need to find an example of one of those things happening. A men's rights lobby against women's voting rights occurring today. Another method by which it gets claimed that the men's rights movement doesn't deal with extremism within the movement is the claim that if we don't track down every comment the critic considers misogynistic in every men's rights forum, even the small ones, that we're not snuffing out extremism within the movement. Now, this claim is generally supported by showing us comments wherein some men's rights activist or some commenter in a men's rights forum, or even a forum within the manosphere that isn't a men's rights forum, has made a statement to the effect that behavior we discuss as dysfunctional when it's done by women is inherently female behavior, such as all women are gold diggers, or all women are lazy, or all women are liars. This particular type of argument is usually made using screenshots of individual comments without context, without linking to the original discussion. It generally contains no evidence of whether or not the individual was argued with, no evidence of whether or not the individual is in any way influential within the movement, and no evidence of whether or not anyone was swayed by the individual's statements. Now, this is not to say that no such statements exist within the movement. Every movement has individuals within it who develop misconceptions based on the evidence presented to them by that particular movement's discussions and research. However, if you're going to use something like that as an argument, you do need to prove that the individual was never challenged on that statement, and you do need to prove that the individual has some degree of influence within the movement. Otherwise, you're simply blowing smoke, especially when that criticism quite frequently comes from feminism, a movement that has actively advocated against equal consideration for human rights where men are concerned, especially in the areas of domestic violence victim services and sexual violence victim services, parental rights, and reproductive rights. and a movement in which the extreme end argues for killing a large section of the male population. Another way in which it is argued that men's rights advocates do not address extremism within the movement is to attribute extremism to positions that are not extreme. A good example of this is in discussion of false accusations. It is not extreme to acknowledge that it is wrong to lie. It is not extreme to acknowledge that it is damaging to an individual who has been lied about when that individual faces criminal charges or social castigation for having been lied about. It is not extreme to acknowledge that when this happens, it is done in violation of existing laws, and very often, the individual who violated those laws gets away with it. Let me give you some examples of the difference. Telling somebody that his sex determines whether or not it's rape when someone forces unwanted sex on him is extreme. Telling someone that his sex decides whether or not he has the right to defend himself against an attacker is extreme. Telling someone that his sex is a reason why genital integrity is less important for him than your opinion on his health is extreme. Telling someone that because of his sex, he's not only responsible for his own actions, but yours as well, is extreme. Telling someone that the law can hold him financially responsible for another person's choice is extreme. It's extreme to say that arguing against the use of lies in the legal system to criminalize individuals who have done nothing wrong is advocacy for crime. It's extreme to say that when somebody is subjected to a false accusation, potentially placed under arrest, slandered in their community, facing criminal charges, criminal trial, potential false imprisonment, job loss, possible assault because of the crime that they're accused of, and many other life-wrecking circumstances, that the primary victim of this is an individual who is not even involved in the situation, those who have been actually victimized by other individuals who have committed the crime that the person is being falsely accused of. The falsely accused are the primary victims of being falsely accused. My final example of this type of argument was covered in my Angry MRAs video, but I'm going to bring it up here as well, and that is the treatment of men's rights discussion of men's issues, where that discussion may be too vehement for women's tastes or feminist tastes as an extreme position. Anytime we criticize areas in which women are privileged, areas in which female privilege impacts negatively on men, anytime we criticize areas in which men suffer dramatically because of legal discrimination, there's going to be a human response. Feminists argue that radical feminism's hatred of men is justified by the existence of things like rape and wife-beating. And those same feminists then turn around and argue that men don't have the same right to be equally outraged at advocacy against men's due process rights, at lobbying to prevent fathers from obtaining equal parental rights, at a half-century's worth of lobbying against services for male victims of intimate partner and sexual violence, and at the fact that bodily autonomy is considered a gendered right, one that excludes men and boys. Men are allowed to be outraged over that discrimination. Men are allowed to be outraged over being treated as second-class citizens. Men are allowed to be angry that feminist researchers deliberately obscured data on female perpetration in order to make it look like sexual violence was a male behavior. Men are allowed to be outraged over that. It's not extreme to be offended by being demonized. It's not extreme to be offended by seeing people argue that you should be treated as a second-class citizen because of your gender. It's not a very effective argument to treat that outrage as illegitimate when you are talking to the people experiencing it. It's not even a very effective argument when you're talking to outsiders to the movement. Because, once again, we in the men's rights movement are going to be right there to correct the record. So if you're going to try to make the middle ground your argument, you might want to first find out where it actually is. And if you're going to criticize extremism within a movement, you might first want to find out what it actually is. Last but not least, if you've encountered a similar accusation that I haven't addressed, or if you have a similar accusation that I haven't addressed, please leave a comment and let me know. I'd be interested to see what else there is out there in terms of accusing the men's rights movement of extremism that hasn't been mentioned in this video. And don't be surprised if there's another video that comes out of it.